we go. Right.
And they're live.
Good morning in Phoenix, or good afternoon if you're in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. It's my privilege to talk again to Jake Tapper. Our first encounter with the first book in this series about the Murdoch family, which was called, I have to look it up again, the Campfire Club, was really fun and sort of a trauma for me because David Baldacci was supposed to be the interviewer, and at the last second, he couldn't log in. So Jake and I got to talk and learned a lot about a path of a piece of my life in the 1950s. And now we're in 1970s, actually 1977. I'm going to tell you again, Jake, it's really unnerving when your life becomes history and people write about it. But the other thing that's amazing is all the stuff I learned about what was going on around me that I was totally unaware of when it was going on around me. So I find that fascinating. So for those of you who don't know who Jake is, which seems very few watching this, I will just say he's the chief DC anchor and chief Washington correspondent for CNN. He hosts the weekday show, The Lead with Jake Tapper, and co-hosts the Sunday public affairs show, State of the Union. And he has written nonfiction as well as these two books, this one, the new one, All the Demons Are Here, about the Murdoch family. And he seems to be progressing through the history of the second half of the 20th century. Is that right?
That's right. I did the first one, The Hellfire Club, was 1954. The second one, The Devil May Dance, was 1962. And this one is 1977. This is the first one I was actually alive for. But like you, I learned quite a bit about what was going on around me at that age that I did not know. Obviously, my parents kept the Summer of Sam and the Son of Sam murders away from me, which I am thankful about.
Right. Well, one of the things that I thought was fascinating, I went back and reviewed. For one thing, let me point out that this is a novel, but Jake has got a terrific list of sources, chapter by chapter, and at the end of the book, which I really advise you to read when you finish the book, and it will lead you into probably, wormholes in the internet while you try to figure out some of it, but it's completely fascinating. I was also not surprised to see that you made up the lyrics for the songs, because for those of you who don't know, if you put lyrics for songs into a book, your agent and your publisher have to pay a fortune in order for you to get the rights. So I was a little worried about that till I saw you made a disclaimer that you made it up.
This was a lesson hard learned in the first book when I had all these songs that I was trying to, you're trying to capture the atmosphere of the 1950s, and what better way to do it than with 1950s songs. And the publisher said, you can't do more than a line. You can't.
Right.
And so for the next book, which The Devil May Dance, which features Frank Sinatra, I wrote an entire song, The Devil May Dance, for Sinatra to sing in a climactic part of the book. And again, the lawyers called me up and said, what are you doing? We told you. And I said, I made the song up. This is not a real song. I made it up. And in fact, I made up 3 songs. And so again, for this one, for All the Demons Are Here, I wrote an AC/DC song, or I forget or Led Zeppelin. I forget. It's Led Zeppelin. Anyway, it's fun writing songs because lyrics are much easier than music for me. So the music you supply in your own head.
Wow. So this is a post correspondent career for Jake, because that he may become a lyricist for who knows who. I love that.
I'm sure it's very lucrative.
Well, if you attach it to the right piece of music or the right performer, I suspect it could become extremely so.
Yeah.
So one of the things I found fascinating in the book, and here again, Jake is probably, although I'm speaking for him, treading an interesting line. And I've done some research myself because I've never actually paid attention to how Rupert Murdoch got started and how his career is developed. And so in this book, we have the Lyons, which is a British media mogul family. And later in the book, you actually mention the Murdochs, which I guess is sort of a way of saying, no, the Lyons aren't really the Murdochs, but actually the Lyons probably really are the Murdochs.
Well, they're definitely, loosely based on them. Yeah.
I love the bit where one of the great clues is, and you mentioned just in a little drop in about their activity in New Zealand, how they went down to New Zealand at the Lyons family and, acquired a paper and did stuff. Because basically Rupert Murdoch invented the tabloid, the scandal sheet, right? Or
Well, he goosed it. I mean, he brought it to a level of dominance in part of American society that has never gone away, and in fact has gotten powerful on television and radio and elsewhere. And since this book takes place in 1977, I thought it'd be, since that is with the Summer of Sam murders,
right.
It is such a time for tabloid journalism to rise to prominence. And I wanted to get in the head of Rupert Murdoch. I didn't want to just have a mustache twirling caricature villain. I wanted Max Lyon, who is loosely based on Murdoch, to be somebody that you could believe existed and you could understand his arguments. And his argument is basically that newspapers at the time didn't care about giving readers what they wanted. They were snobby and elitist. And certainly you could understand that argument. And Lucy, who is one of the main characters in the book, it's Lucy and Ike, who are the kids of the main characters from my two previous books. Lucy's a journalist. Ike is a Marine who's gone AWOL. And Lucy is trying to break into journalism. And she sees how the New York Times is barely covering the Son of Sam murders, whereas the New York Daily News and the New York Post are covering them quite a bit. And so Max Lyon's arguments, she's hearing them and she's seeing his point of view. Obviously, when you chase eyeballs above all else, obviously when you decide, and which Rupert Murdoch has been fairly unabashed saying, that rage and fear drive news consumer behavior, that leads one to a path that we know. We've seen it and we know what that means. But this is the beginning of the tabloid era in the United States of America. So it was fun to kind of capture it and talk about it at in its relative infancy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it reminded me the first time Rob and I went to New Zealand, my husband and I went to New Zealand, was the 50th anniversary of the year that Sir Edmund Hillary had climbed Mount Everest. And so they had this, phenomenal coverage in it. And anyway, this is the first time I encountered that style tabloid, the Rupert, the UK. It's so big in size that you can't really read it. I mean, it's much, much bigger than the New York Times. So you have this enormous piece of paper. And the reason I was, the guy, one of the people on the airplane was reading it, and he kept, in order to read pages, he kept doing this, and he hit me on the head. But I didn't recognize it wasn't, Jake. It was also the format, not just the content, but it was the format that screamed for attention.
Yeah. Well, the one story or two stories on the front page as opposed to 10, and sensationalist coverage, and trying to grab people where they are and pull them in, as opposed to just having a newspaper that we expect you to read this because it's important. And I try to present this argument and Lucy's role in exploring tabloid journalism in a way where people can understand it. They can understand why she would be excited to cover a serial killer for a newspaper that is treating her and her gifts with, respect and excitement, and why they are putting this serial killer on the front page when maybe other newspapers at the time, even though my serial killer in DC is fictitious, wouldn't have. And look, it's part of who we are today, right? I mean, Rupert Murdoch remains one of the most powerful people in the world. Obviously, Fox is hugely successful as a business venture. Journalistically, it's different. I mean, you can't look at Fox and say, these are the most respected journalists in broadcasting. Here are all the Emmys awards they've won. Here are all the Peabodys here, but they do have a dominance for what they do. Obviously, Lucy learns some tough lessons, and I don't want to spoil anything, but when you chase eyeballs above facts and truth, that leads you in a place that for Lucy is dangerous, and her life is, at risk. And then, we all know what's going on in contemporary life with tabloid journalists enterprises having to pay, record-breaking settlements for their efforts to pursue eyeballs above truth.
Right. Well, one of the reasons I mentioned the size was that it also made photographs, so much more visible, so that when things were displayed on a newsstand, it was like a banner. But speaking of fake news, one of the things that I was reminded of, because you do go back into some of the demagogues of the period, and when you go back to McCarthy, I grew up north of Chicago, so right next to Wisconsin, so I remember this very well. But McCarthy's statement, the thing that catapulted him into from being sort of a boring senator from Wisconsin into sort of national prominence, was his statement that he had, what was it, cards from or proof of 200.
I have here a list. Yeah,
my list, exactly, the black
of
list
communists in the State Department, of communists in the Pentagon, of et cetera, et cetera.
And, that's the kind of thing that tabloid news thrives on, that fake news thrives on. And I was going to ask you, because you probably, was he ever forced to prove that he had that list and that the list was valid?
No, I mean, he was asked many times, but the lists were not presented to the press. As I understand it, McCarthy is a huge character, as you know, Barbara, in my first book, The Hellfire Club. But ultimately, he overreached, and in 1954, when the Hellfire Club takes place, were the Army McCarthy hearings, and it became clear that he was he lost the country, he lost the plot. People stopped believing him. He was censured by the U.S. Senate, and he died of alcoholism-related illness in 1957. But what's interesting because you bring this up is I don't know who said it, but it is often said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And that's one of the things I try to explore when I'm writing these books, is the connective tissue between what we're feeling and what we're going through today and what previous generations have gone through. So I write about McCarthy, and of course there is the connective tissue. Joe McCarthy's protege was Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn's protege was Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And Roy Cohn appears in the new book, All the Demons Are Here. I won't say where he shows up, but it's a fun and interesting place, given all the crazy and insane things going on in this era in 1977, which is such a wild time and so fun to write about, because you have the prominence of Evel Knievel, the stuntman, who I write about quite a bit in the book, the death of Elvis, the New York City blackout, the opening of Studio 54 and the rise of disco, UFOs, cults, all sorts of things that are resonant to today. 1977 was there was such a mistrust of government and a mistrust of the Pentagon because of all the lies that had been told during Watergate and the Vietnam War. And it reminded me of today. It reminded me of how much distrust there is today in American society. And so that's one of the fun things, is to try to look for the rhyming, right? Look for the things that happened back then that are not exactly the same, but one can see that we've been here before as a country, and we've gotten through it. We've gotten through it okay.
Well, we have. I mean, I thought, you've traced a sort of interesting line of demagogues, and we can, or the people that support them. Did you read that amazing editorial in the Times last Sunday about why MAGA Republicans, remain MAGA Republicans?
By David French.
What he talked about, the thing being a booze cruise, I just cracked up. But at the same time, I thought, how right he is that we're missing the fun of it,
100%. David French is such a brilliant op-ed writer.
Right.
If people don't know, he's a conservative, not a Trump fan, a devout Christian, former Iraq War veteran, who he writes about what some of the people are missing who criticize MAGA and criticize the Trump movement, is they miss the degree to which people who are part of the movement are having fun. Mm-hmm. People only see the negative, they only see the anger and the invective. But to the people who are adherents to Trump, that's not what they see necessarily. They see a lot more that's enjoyable. And that's actually one of the things I wanted to get into in this book by writing about Evel Knievel. So Lucy is in the world of tabloid journalism. Ike, her little brother, who's an AWOL Marine, he is working with Evel Knievel on his pit crew in Montana. And for people who don't know, Evel Knievel was this hugely successful stuntman, motorcyclist in the 70s.
Right.
At this point, his career is kind of like going downhill, but he is very, very, he's very, very Trump-like in some ways, a precursor to Trump. And I'm not saying this in a negative way, but he is a salesman. He is a showman. He is somebody who understands how to get media attention. He is somebody who understands how to appeal to some members of the public by seeming to be kind of like naughty, a bad boy, a truth speaker. And whatever you think of Donald Trump, that is a quintessentially American archetype, whether it's P.T. Barnum or Donald Trump or Evel Knievel. There is this kind of character that captures the attention of people. And what I wanted to get at was some of the fun of it, some of why, because in the book, this is not a spoiler in particular, but in the book, Evel Knievel launches kind of a bogus run for president just to get some attention and publicity because his film career and his stunt career is not going so great. That part's true, but the presidential campaign is not true. But he gets supporters and they go cross country. And what I wanted to get at was some of the fun of it. Why does somebody like this able to attract followers? Some of the followers have grievances. Some of the grievances are real. Some of the grievances are not real. But that also seemed very resonant to where we are today. But again, I wanted to portray it not in a tut-tutting, arrogant, disapproving way, but kind of a exploration of why somebody like this gets followers and the fun of it. As you note, David French wrote that brilliant column that I really do think gets at something that people who disapprove of Trump miss, which is people think he's funny, people think he's charming, people think being part of this movement that rails against, the evil governments, the dark, the dark deep state and all that. They think that that's an enjoyable thing to be a part of.
Here's the sort of parallel. Let's talk about Taylor Swift for a second.
Oh,
and
yeah.
That spills over. She started her tour here in Phoenix, and it's slated, I guess, to become the first concert tour that grosses $1 billion. Now, I didn't think a whole lot about it when it was all going on around me, although we could see, the Ticketmaster and the government involved in regulating Ticketmaster and the sort of group thing. But when it really came home to me is that we did the book launch for Riley Sager on, I think it was June 19th. And despite the horrible temperature, we had a completely packed house and everybody seemed to be kind of, almost like a concert venue. But what I realized as we got the conversation going is that at least half of them were Swifties because Riley is a notable Swiftie. And so the conversation towards the end with audience questions wasn't so much about the book as it was about Taylor Swift. And I was fascinated with that, that cultural crossover there, or that kind of blending of a tribal kind of a thing, the Swifties and Riley's fan club together. I was fascinated.
I'm living with it because I have a 15-year-old daughter and a wife who adores the 15-year-old daughter. I adore her too, but I'm not really welcome as a Swiftie. And so I was the one that went on the computer and waited in line and bought the tickets. But I have seen this Swiftie phenomenon. And it's funny, I went out to dinner with a famous musician and his daughter, and we went out with my wife and me. I would mention him, but I didn't ask permission to share the story. But in any case, my wife and the daughter spent the entire dinner talking about Taylor Swift. And the musician and I were just sitting there watching, and about like, she is, I think, the closest thing that we've seen since the Elvis and the Beatles.
Yeah, exactly.
Like in terms of just the devout, it's not a cult. I don't want to insult them, but it is a tribe, as you say. It's
definitely a tribe. And the other part that's interesting and plays into the Trump thing to some degree is a lot of these people cannot actually afford it. I was looking at the prices and the resale prices. I don't know if you noticed, but again, in the Times on Sunday, the Ephesus column, all 4 questions revolved around Taylor Swift concert tickets and, how they should be allocated or distributed, or could you resell them for the extraordinary value that $365 it cost versus the over $3,000 it's currently worth. And, I was just blown away by the whole thing. But yeah, it does remind me of the Beatles, all of that excitement. I remember I was actually watching Ed Sullivan's presentation of Elvis Presley on the.
Oh, were you really?
Well, I'm old enough. I remember very well him coming out on the Ed Sullivan show. And I remember the Beatles coming on to that. And, it is a tribal thing. And there is, a connection and a sense of joy and all these other things that I do think that rule politics, but I also think, going back to the tabloids we've been talking about, that it plays into all of that. But to be more serious about the book, you also do talk about, a succession of presidents, good and bad. So we have Eisenhower, and then we have
Kennedy,
and
LBJ, Nixon,
LBJ, right? Yeah. And how that goes, and who was, and Carter's president while this book is going on. Right? Yeah.
So,
first of all, there are not a lot of good things being said about Jimmy Carter in the context of this book, not because he's a bad person, but just in his role as chief executive.
So I want to get to that for 1 second, but I do want to touch on what you just said about tribes. And I don't know, I have to plead ignorant. I don't know what it's like in other countries. I assume this phenomenon is a human thing, not an American thing. But the idea of tribes, of a tribe of people who believe in this book, a tribe of people who believe in Evel Knievel and believe he's going to solve their problems, and they follow him across the country, is similar. And you're so right to bring it to Taylor Swift, to these phenomenons we see, whether it's Deadheads following the Grateful Dead around, or Swifties, of people wanting to belong and wanting something to believe in. Mm-hmm. And again, the people I have in this mob following Evel Knievel around are not, some of them are crazy, but some of them are quite sympathetic. And Ike is in this mob with them. He is part of this mob. And it's not something that I look at pejoratively. It's something that I look at with true fascination and interest. Why would this group be going across the country? What is it like? How, to what end? Okay, to your point. So Eisenhower is in the first book. And since Charlie Martyr, the main character, one of the main characters, is a World War II hero, he reveres Eisenhower. Mm-hmm. The second book, John F. Kennedy is president. And the Kennedy administration kind of blackmails Charlie and his wife, Margaret, to go investigate the Rat Pack to find out if Sinatra's really mobbed up. Third book, Jimmy Carter's just been elected president. It's a time of national malaise. The main characters, Charlie and Margaret, although the book is mainly about their kids, Charlie's a Republican, so he's not a fan of Carter, kind of like a moderate Rockefeller Republican. And Jimmy Carter is, he's in the book because things he says and do are relevant to the book. One of his speechwriters is one of Lucy's ex-boyfriends. So there is a character from the White House who's in the book, but he's it's not a political book per se in terms of judging Jimmy Carter. It's more of Jimmy Carter as kind of a cultural figure, just as Elvis Presley and his death in 1977 is a cultural figure. I mean, I bet a lot of people don't know that Jimmy Carter said that he has seen UFOs. That comes out in the book. That's a real story. When he was, I think, governor of Georgia, he reported that he had seen UFOs. And that's another one of these kind of weird phenomenon, trends going on in the United States in the 1970s at a time when people are really mistrustful of government and don't quite believe everything they're being told after Vietnam and Watergate. There are all these UFO sightings, which was, that I do remember from my childhood in the 70s, that the prevalence of that. And that's when Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind and all these, that's when the space stuff really started happening and seizing the attention of our popular culture.
Absolutely. Roswell, New Mexico.
Yeah, totally.
It is. And, there are these waves of things that come and go. And we look back and we think, how is that possible? But at the time, it seems perfectly plausible. Going back to citing one other journalist, who I can't remember at the moment, and I don't remember if it was in the Wall Street Journal or the Times last weekend. I'm going to mention too that it's really hard to read a newspaper one-handed, so I might be slightly confused.
And just so people know, I have asked you about this, and you are on the mend, and I am.
Thank you.
Very sympathetic.
I have to hold it up to permitted swelling. It's just surgery. It's not an accident. It'll get better. It's all a good thing. And I love my little black thumb. But anyway, it doesn't operate too well. But anyway, the other article I read, which I thought about reading your book, and which I thought was relevant, was it talked about waves in the presidency of age and then change, and then you get a group. So we went from Eisenhower, who was in his 60s, I guess, late 60s, to Kennedy, who's in his 40s, and now we have this age debate going on, because we have two nearly octogenarians.
Well, one of them, one is an octogenarian. Trump is nearly an octogenarian.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, as an octogenarian, in a way, I kind of present the idea that, I can't actually fulfill my normal functions because I can't.
Well, let me ask you a question. You obviously are super sharp and you don't look anything close to your age, but do you think any question about anybody's abilities as they age to be, do you think any question on that is unfair?
No, not at all. And I think, honestly, I have to admit that there are age-related things. I mean, aside from arthritis surgery, it takes longer for me to remember. I used to be absolutely fabulous at it. Names, names of people, names of titles, stuff like that. And there's a common misconception that people forget it, but I really like the analogy to computers, because what I think happens is that the retrieval system has grown so vast in my brain that it takes longer to bring it back. Because if I'd actually forgotten it, I couldn't remember it. Sometimes it takes like 3 or 4 minutes for me to do that. I was ordering a book from a pseudonymous author yesterday, and it took me 3 or 4 minutes before I could remember not what his current name is, but his sued, for example. So I think that
pretty understandable.
Yeah, but I mean, I do think that things like that are going to be a problem, if you're in moments of lots of pressure for instant decisions. Physically, you get tired, whatever. So no, I think they're very valid points. But I also think if you look at the age of some of the people that served in the Senate, if you want to make arguments, which I would love to, about term limits for the Supreme Court and for Congress, because I think the only way we can really reform our Constitution would be to go with term limits. I mean, I'm really a passionate fan of term. When they wrote the Constitution, how many people actually lived into their 90s, late 80s? Well,
that's right. The average age was probably like 45 or something.
Well, I mean, it didn't occur to him that you'd have justices sitting on the court, at that age. And I also think any decent organization really at some point needs to turn over its CFO. There's a point beyond, obviously, the Rupert Murdoch family is not there yet, but in most cases,
he's in his 90s.
Yeah, 92. But generally speaking, in corporations, charitable organizations, and so forth, there's a moment in which it becomes clear, sort of the arguments about Putin in a way, that it's time for a change, that people get too invested in, too encrusted, whatever it is. Well, if you've got, somebody that can stay in a powerful office with absolutely no, there's no, accountability, so to speak, for 30 some years, that's just really bad practice aside from anything else. I mean, it's bad corporate practice. So
it's pretty incredible. And I don't know how much of this people are taught in school, but it's pretty incredible that presidents only serve 2 terms as a tradition until they amended the Constitution during FDR's reign. But for 150 years or whatever it was, until FDR ran for his 4th term and then they amended the Constitution to make it only 2 terms, presidents only did 2 terms because that was it was a gentleman's tradition started by George Washington. But I mean, it is pretty remarkable that you think that as a tradition it lasted that long. And I think there are a lot of things in American political life as we age, and also as we age as a country, where things that were kind of just kept as gentlemen's agreements, for want of a better term, are going to have to be enshrined into law, or we're going to have to start to rethink them because of how different today is from when a lot of these laws and the Constitution and such were written.
Well, if there's been a value for Donald Trump, which I won't debate right at the moment, he is a human wrecking ball. And he has come in and shown us that these things that people observed out of tradition and out of respect didn't mean anything to him. And, therefore, we're going to be forced into, I think, as you say, enshrining some things in law that were basically, and that's the British Constitution is having the same problem. Look at Boris Johnson. So, they've gotten along for centuries, on kind of respect and tradition and agreements that are not enshrined in law. So
yeah,
we'll see, there's so many things that the world is changing every day around us. It's very hard to keep up. But back to 1977, let's talk a little bit about Ike. We've mentioned Lucy, the journalist who's working for a city in Washington, and who does not get credit for, or she writes a story and the credit for it is kind of diverted.
Yeah, it's taken from her.
Right. And so she gets an offer from this Lyons tabloid publishing family, the British family, to maybe join them, and she does, and that leads to all kinds of things. But we haven't really talked about Ike. And Ike, you've created an incident that happened to him in Beirut.
Yeah.
Completely
fictitious.
Well, but we're back to fake news again, Jake.
Right.
Because, we are, because the Marines created a story around Ike, which he knows is not true.
Right.
So
I don't want to spoil it, because it's a big moment in the book when you find out what actually happened in Lebanon.
Right.
But Ike, one of the reasons Ike is AWOL is because he was injured in this Marine expedition in Beirut, Lebanon. And the Marines did ultimately go into Lebanon, but my expedition is made up. And this is, again, during a period where people were really starting to wonder, is the Pentagon telling us everything? Are they being honest? The New York Times at this point had published the Pentagon Papers, which showed that the military knew much more about how the Vietnam War was unwinnable, and yet kept on sending soldiers to die there over and over and over. And presidents knew it too. So Ike, in a lot of ways, beyond the drama and the story of what he went through, he is in a way supposed to be a representative of all of us, of not understanding why governments lie, still wanting to believe in the United States, still wanting to believe in what the United States stands for. Charlie, his dad, was a World War II hero. So he was raised at the feet of somebody who, legitimately fought to defeat Nazism and tyranny. He joins the Marines. He gets sent on this mission, and everything goes wrong on the mission. And then the Pentagon uses him as a story of heroism to distract from what really went on. And then he goes AWOL, and that's how he ends up with Evel Knievel in Montana on his pit crew. But that's supposed to be about kind of the mistrust we all feel, and the the fact that we have not been told the truth. And this isn't just the 70s, right? I mean, remember all the stories we would hear about heroism in Afghanistan or heroism in Iraq, and then it would come out months later that the story was completely invented by the Pentagon. This is 15 years ago I'm talking, not 30 or 40, and it would turn out to be completely untrue. And that's so Ike is us. Ike is all of us in that story. Obviously, the drama and the feelings he's going through and everything he's experiencing, having to do with Evel Knievel, having to do with his dad and all that. intended to be fun and enjoyable for us to read, but it's also intended for us to identify with, about not understanding the world that we thought we were living in, and realizing that it's a lot shadier than we thought, than we've been led to believe.
Well, one of the things that adds some extra dimension to this is Ike is AWOL. He's definitely AWOL, and yet nobody's coming after him. He is visible. And so you have to ask yourself, you know, as you're reading about Ike, how is it? You know, anybody else who was AWOL would have been, you know, hauled back and probably in the brig or whatever it is. And so Ike instead is traveling with Evel Knievel.
Right.
So I think that also ups that, you know, whole question of credibility. Why did you pick Lebanon? I mean, again, this is all about me, right? Not about Jake. So my first husband's father was our ambassador to Lebanon in 1956.
Oh, wow.
An actual, it was just right before I went to Stanford, but, you know, it carried over. And there was a major incident in Lebanon,
Right,
where, you know, we didn't get into a much bigger situation than we could. But why did you pick Lebanon for the incident in Ike's life?
because U.S. adventurism in Lebanon began around that time, and you know, and Carter and then Reagan sent Marines into Lebanon. There was a civil war going on. Ultimately, there was a huge, horrible, tragic bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut during the Reagan years, and he pulled out the Marines from Lebanon. But it just seemed plausible. It seemed like something that the U.S. military would have done. I just want, you know, I make up so much for this book, but I don't. And yes, obviously there are dramatic scenes that are wild, and you need to just enjoy them as a reader. They're not, you know, it's fiction. I'm trying to have fun. I'm trying to you know, make you enjoy yourself. But it just seemed like it needs to be grounded enough in reality that people can read it and allow the flights of fancy for like certain action or certain scenes, but the base of it needs to feel real. And so for Ike to have a reason to have gone AWOL, and there need to have been a military incident that went really wrong, and that just seemed like one that could have happened. I mean, when I was reading about the era and trying to come up with the plot,
Sure.
the Marines in Lebanon,
It's a reminder that it was all global. You know, I mean, it wasn't all Vietnam all the time, although
right
past Vietnam, but
we were shifting our attention towards the Middle East at that time in terms of sending troops, and I mean, that was the Marines in Lebanon kept popping up over and over. So that it just seemed credible.
Sure. I've been watching thriller writers cycling back to Russia, you know, because for a while after, in the early aughts and so forth, so much of thriller writing, the action took place in the Middle East. And now here we are again with Russia and China. So, you know, goes on and on. I want to read a quote that somebody supplied. Actually, the somebody who supplied it was Don Winslow, a wonderful author.
Great author, great guy.
He is a great guy. I'm pleased to say that he started his signing career at the Poison Pen, and we've been privileged to host him for all of his books. But he's a very insightful guy, and I think he sums up one reason I really like this series that Jake is writing so well. Don says, here's a fantastic and engrossing thriller that travels the reader through one of the most fascinating periods in American history. Tapper has a deep understanding of the subject he writes about and presents a rich tapestry of politics, life, and culture, and shows how they intersect and collide. He's emerged as a writer of fine craft, detail, and observation. And I'd like to underline that because actually Jake is a really good novelist. I mean, you know, he is a reporter, and we're talking about real stuff here and footnotes and sources and all the rest of it. But we haven't really talked about the fact that is a great reading experience.
Oh,
So,
you're so kind.
well, no, I'm not being kind. I wouldn't say it if I didn't believe it. I'm not a fan of fake journalism. When I
Right.
do this, I turn down a lot of events because I can't actually be enthusiastic about the book. It's a privilege I have as the kind of bookstore, a nonprofit bookstore we are, is that I don't have to accept everything that might make money.
Well, I'm very honored. I always love doing Poison Pen events because you're such a legitimate force in the literary world, not just for your store, but for your enthusiasm about fiction. It's a tough market, for authors. No one's, I mean, I'm not asking anybody to feel bad for me, but I'm just saying, like, writing is it's tough enough, but it's like getting tougher and tougher. One of the things that I tried to, I was just at the Chicago Humanities Festival. I was interviewing Stacey Abrams about her new thriller, which is fun. And one of the guys who works there told me that it's just getting tougher and tougher because people don't read as much. And he said he used to see people reading books at L stops in Chicago, and they're not anymore. And I said, well, I hope that they're reading on their phones, because I know I'm always reading like 4 books at once, and one of them is always on my Kindle on my phone. So maybe they're just reading them there. But the market, the environment is getting tough, and so it's always great to have people like you who are the infrastructure of the literary world. You're like a bridge, a mighty strong bridge holding up authors as we try to cross and get our literature to people to read. So I really am grateful for you and what you do.
Well, thank you. I'm grateful for you and what you do, because, otherwise the reading experience would be depressing. I do think that the rise of audiobooks in part is explained by what Jake is talking about, that people's time is more fragmented, that, there are studies that show that the constant scrolling and the impact of it all has not only diverts our attention, but kind of rewires our brains. So it's harder to sit, for an hour or two and actually interact with a book. So
but I listen to audiobooks. I do.
Right.
What I do is, and it's a little crazy, but so I have a book that I'm reading on Kindle, and I have something that I'm listening to on Audible. Right now I'm listening to Paul Newman's posthumous memoir. And then I'll usually have another book that I'm reading the paper version of as well. But I do it all. But I got nothing against audiobooks, by the way. I
was being in favor of audiobooks. All I was saying is that maybe reading has shifted to listening to some degree, but we still require the story. We still need the creator and the content, whether we're listening to it in the car or while we're gardening, or whether we're sitting in our library. I'm in my library right now, reading a book. The story is still what counts. They used to sit around campfires, and, I've been to Anse Meadow, or the tip of Newfoundland, or where, I think that's where it is. And, think about the Vikings sitting around in their longhouse, with their bards and singing songs to them.
Oh, I think about it all the time. There's a campfire scene in my book, and all the demons are here. They're sitting around a campfire as this convoy of motorcycles are traveling cross country, and they stop right near Mount Rushmore. And they're sitting around a fire, talking about, I don't know how, I don't think I could live without fiction. I don't think I could live without stories in which to dive. I love nonfiction. It's obviously my primary gig is nonfiction, is telling the news. And I do write, nonfiction as well. But fiction allows us, I heard Jake Gyllenhaal talking about on a podcast, talking about how a director he'd worked with had said, making things up, I'm paraphrasing, but making things up allows us to tell the truth in a way. Fiction allows us in some ways to drive at greater emotional truths that you can't get at necessarily with nonfiction as easily or as compellingly. So in any case,
No, I completely agree with you. I think fiction is how stories are how we make sense of the world. I mean, you can go all the way back to Homer. You can look at the mnemonic techniques, for example, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Why is it called the Wine Dark Sea? Because that was like a pause,
right.
for the storyteller to remember the next section of whatever the story was. I mean, people have been telling stories as long as, we've had any kind of language and consciousness about it. For example, I'm really a fan of biographies because I often think that the biographer can get to a truth of a life in a way that certainly an autobiography can't, because there's self-protective stuff going on there.
It depends on the autobiography, because I am learning some pretty damning stuff from Paul Newman's posthumous memoir.
Really?
That is, I don't know if you read it, but it is.
No, I'd love to, because I admire him greatly, but I also think that he probably was a deeper truth teller, had a deeper understanding of himself maybe than other people in his time and profession.
It's just stark stuff. I mean, I'm not here to pitch Paul Newman's book, but I'll say that like his candor about his affair with Joanne Woodward, which I didn't know went on for like 4 or 5 years, and his candor about his refusal to sign autographs or take pictures with people, both of them I just find jarring. I mean, I guess it's refreshing in the sense that he didn't skate over it and that he didn't sugarcoat any of it. Well, he does a little bit with the Joanne Woodward stuff, but in any case, it's just out there, and you like it or you don't like it, and it's pretty interesting. I did, when I write these books, I do a lot of research, obviously, about Elvis Presley, about Evel Knievel, and so books, as you know from reading the book, 2 books play a role in my book, and both of them are real books. One of them is Elvis, What Happened, which is a tabloid paperback written by the Murdoch Empire, and Steve Dunleavy in cooperation with some Elvis former bodyguards, which supposedly this book and its publication set Elvis on this horrible bender that ultimately resulted in his death. And then the other book, another real book, is a book written by a guy named Shelley Saltman, who was a promoter for Evel Knievel. And I think it's called something like The Real Evel Knievel. I don't have the book with me right now, but in any case, that publication of that book, both of these books in my book become plot points because they were very important at the time. And both of them were kind of like supermarket paperbacks, which was a really thriving industry in the 1970s and hugely impactful on the culture. And for people who don't know, Evel Knievel got I don't want to spoil it, but this is true. What happens to Evel Knievel at the end of my book is what happened to Evel Knievel in real life as a result of his anger about this paperback being published about him.
Well, and here again, I recommend that you turn to the back of the book when you've read the novel and look at the sources that Jake talks about. I've never asked you this, but are you a person who loves physical books, not the content, not the story and all, but are you kind of a biblio guy?
Yeah, I have a huge library.
Okay,
Looks like it would rival yours.
Next time
maybe.
I come to Washington, because before I was a bookseller, I was a librarian at the Library of Congress. I was in the intern program and went over to the dark side, as they have pointed out to me. But anyway, I am married to a Rosenwald, so the major collection at the Library of Congress is in fact the Lessing J. Rosenwald collection.
Right.
Right. Well, so I love the fact that once I was an intern at the Library of Congress, and now I actually have my own librarian at the Library of Congress, which is really fun. But when I come to Washington, which we haven't done for a while, they will let me bring people, and they will set up a special thing in the Rosenwald room.
Oh,
bring in the books.
Please call me. Let me see
I
it.
will. I've done that
for
a number of people. And since you're there, it's a really fascinating thing. And, the technology, aside from everything else Jake and I have talked about, the evolving technology of books is a fascinating subject. But in point of fact, the codex, which is this form, as opposed to the scroll, which was the fax, and the Great Library of Alexandria and all was a scroll library, not a codex. The codex has held up for millennia as, an amazing tool, an amazing art form, and a great storytelling medium and so forth. And every once in a while, when you go and look at one of those storied collections, it reminds you of that the form of the book can also be part of the reading experience. A really beautiful book, a medieval book of hours, or, a book with forage paintings and so forth, can truly add to, the entire experience. And I do worry that the digital age, people may never experience that. They may never really be, look around me here,
Yeah.
my 2000 may never happen,
Well, there are a couple signs of life in the printed word beyond just the continued existence of books. One is Dave Eggers, the author, does a lot of stuff with his publishing house out in, I think, San Francisco, where they really do a lot to care about the book itself and the binding and the illustrations. And it is really interesting and fascinating what they do. Pardon me. And then the other thing is graphic novels, which I don't know how much of a connoisseur you are of that world. My impression is not much, but
well, I have younger staff who are definitely so.
The world of graphic novels and the people at like Kitchen Sink Press and other places like that,
right.
They really do. I got a copy of a book that was giant, and I got another copy of one. One was a giant. It was of a modern author, Daniel Clowes, but then another one I got a copy of some old. Do you remember? Well, you're not. There was a strip at the turn of the century called like Little Nemo and Slumberland, and It was back when newspapers, these broadsheets were enormous, and the comics pages were everything, and they were color and intricate and beautiful, and so I bought a book that was along those lines, but like reprinted in its full size, and so there are still signs of life there. But I agree. And I remember when I wrote a book about the Florida recount back in 2001, I wanted to do little illustrations of different players, because I do some cartooning too of the players, and I wanted to put them in the book. It was my first like real make book, and they didn't want to do it, so they said no, and I didn't fight it. But maybe more of us in the publishing world, maybe more of us need to be pushing for things so that to make publishers rethink how we put out books, so that it encourages people to buy the actual hardcover as opposed to the ebook or the audiobook. If you're promised in this next book, Don Winslow did drawings of his time investigating the Medellin cartel or whatever, maybe you'd be more inclined to buy the book. I don't know, just a thought.
Well, here's two great examples. Art Spiegelman's Mouse, one of the banned book things. My husband, who I've already mentioned, is from a distinguished Jewish family, said he never could have read that if it hadn't been an illustrated story. That it was so awful that the illustrations make it create.
Yeah, and I just bought a new book by Spiegelman about his work as a younger man. He's brilliant. He's a genius. And
he is. But there's an example. But the other book, you should rush right out and get a copy of it, is by Jason Rekulek, Rekulak, I think it is, or Lek, called Hidden Pictures. And I'm telling you, Jake, that one of the characters in the book, the entire voice of this character that runs all the way through the book, is a series of drawings. It's a child. And the drawings become more and more vivid and slightly more sophisticated as the story goes on. But that silent voice all the way to the end is the heart of that book. And it's absolutely brilliant. I have hand sold zillions of copies of it. The book would never be the same if it weren't for the fact that one of the characters' voice is entirely pictorial. And it's been a big success. And I'm kind of Grady Hendrix, and I did if not the launch, at least a conversation about it.
Don't forget the Little Prince. The Little Prince.
Yeah, all right.
The author is writing, he's doing little doodles and writing about the doodles, and they explain the plot and the author's point of view.
Yeah. So illustrations in children's books are really important. In adult fiction has been less so. But if you go back and look at classics, where Howard Pyle was the illustrator, for example, our images, of Robin Hood and, Ivanhoe and all that, are absolutely fabulous. You know what? We're going to keep Jake over time and he has to go to work. So let me call up Ian to see if we have any questions from the audience. Now, while Ian is emerging, if you've enjoyed this conversation, Jake will be on The View tomorrow morning. So it'll be probably a whole different conversation, but for those of you who are interested, you might want to tune in. What time is it on, Jake?
I think The View, it's different times for different parts of the country. I think it's on 11, but let me double check. While you're punching up the questions, I'll find out if The View is on. I know what time it's on in DC, but I don't know what time it's on throughout the world.
Every conversation with an author is going to be different, so you can get additional perspective. Ian, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. First question for Jake is, do we need to read the previous 2 books before reading this one?
I think The View is on at 11 a.m. everywhere. I think it adjusts for time slots, but check your local listings. No, you do not.
No.
You do not have to read the 2 previous books. I write them as standalone so that you don't have to read 1 to understand 2. You don't have to read 1 and 2 to understand 3. You'll get into it. I don't presume that everybody has read everything I've ever written. And so you can pick up number 3, All the Demons Are Here, and plunge right in and you'll get it.
Yeah. And then you'll want to go back and read books 1 and 2, but you can definitely start with 3.
Hopefully.
What do you think about AI writing and taking over other jobs?
I think it's horrible. I think it's an awful idea. And I don't support it in any way. I have used AI. I've played with AI when it comes to illustrations, not for anything professional, but just, for fun or for, I did a couple promotional reels for my book in which I just asked them to, like, here's what I picture Ike to look like, here's what I picture Lucy to look like. But I'm uncomfortable using it professionally, and especially when it comes to writing. Also, AI is wrong all the time, like all the time.
My husband has used it and says it's frequently wrong. And
always. Like
right.
somebody introduced me at some event and they were reading from, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. My wife and my kids played with AI and they had a bio of me written and they read it to me, and like half of the information was wrong, just blatantly wrong. I mean, not negative, just wrong.
I'm also going to quote Dave Barry here, because I asked him when we did his book event in May whether he was too worried about AI taking over for him. And I love Dave Barry. And Dave Barry looked at me and he said, no, he said it won't have a sense of humor.
No, it won't. But Alan Alda did an interesting thing on his podcast where he interviewed a bot, and it was really, and then the bot tried to write an episode or a scene in MASH. And I think he and Mike Farrell, who played BJ Honeycutt, if memory serves, they acted out the scene. I might be wrong, but yeah, it didn't have any sense of humor at all. It was not funny.
Right. So I don't think it can ever achieve a human voice in the same way.
It's in its infancy though, so who knows?
Yeah, I know. It's pretty scary. Right. All right, Ian, carry on.
Did you ever get to see Evel Knievel perform live?
I did not. The truth is, I was not an Evel Knievel fan as a kid. I just, for whatever reason, it passed me by. I mean, I knew of him, and I knew of people who were fans of his, who were friends of mine, who had the Evel Knievel action figure and all that. But he was not a character I really bonded with. But I was fishing out west, and a friend of mine is a huge fan of Evel Knievel. And his fandom kind of convinced me to look into Evel Knievel, and he became a great character for me to write about, although not a great person. He was a pretty bad guy. So no, I never saw him. I don't remember him except vaguely, that my friend had a toy of him, but no, not really. But I was 8 years old in 1977, so there's a lot that happened in the 70s that passed me by that I don't remember. It was fun going back and diving into it and learning more about it.
I was 37 in 1977. And let me tell you, a lot of it passed me by too, that Jake has brought to me. So that's great. Well, I didn't mention that here in All the Demons Are Here, Jake does a great job with motorcycles. I mean, Ike is a dedicated, motorcycle guy, and you obviously picked up his love for motorcycles. And, that's another tribe that is
So
part
can
of.
I tell you? I
Sure.
know nothing about motorcycles. So I wrote, but obviously Ike loves motorcycles. Evel Knievel loves motorcycles. And there are 3 action scenes that require knowledge of motorcycles. So I wrote the scenes, and then I hired this really smart motorcyclist / writer named Mark Gardner, who I credit in the acknowledgments of the book. I just said, like, I don't know anything about motorcycles. Tell me what I got wrong here. And I sent him a draft, and he made lots of suggestions, and he was great. Again, he's in the acknowledgments of the book. But that was the thing. Like, I hate it when, as a journalist, I'm watching a TV show and it covers something about politics or journalism, and it just gets it completely wrong. Right. And it just takes me out of it. It means I don't enjoy it as much, etc. So I did not want anyone who has ever ridden a motorcycle to feel that way about my book. So I hired Mark, and he was super helpful and really an interesting writer in his own right.
Well, it certainly adds depth to your book, and a genuine engagement, I think.
You have to believe that Ike loves his stuff and knows what he's talking about, even if I don't.
That's right.
I mean, my dad's a pediatrician. My mom's a pediatric nurse. It was drilled into my head throughout my entire life. Do not ever ride a motorcycle. So I never did.
Excellent choice. Right.
Was there a public or political figure from the era that inspired you, similar to how you talked about being inspired by Margaret Chase Smith for the Hellfire Club?
Oh, that's such a good question. No, but Woodward and Bernstein as journalists are heroes of Lucy's as a journalist in the book, and they are characters in All the Demons Are Here. They show up in chapter 2, and then they show up again at the end of the book. And they and their doggedness and their reporting were real inspirations to me then and now. And I gave them early copies also, so they could check it out and reach out if they had any issues. But they've been portrayed in so many movies and TV shows. I don't think they really particularly cared. I mean, they've been portrayed by Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman pretty famously, so they didn't have any notes for me.
Right. But, again, another of the pleasures of this book are the real people that wander in and out. I mean, Ike and Lucy and the martyrs are all made up, but there are all kinds of real life people.
Oh, yeah. Ronald Reagan pops up. Yep, yeah, absolutely.
And it really will send you, I think, into following the references and so forth, or just, looking up stuff. It's a wonderful way. I mean, a lot of people don't like history courses or think that history is a dry and dull subject and they don't need to learn from it or anything. But honestly, Jake, I think your books are it's a wonderful way to learn about, work. And that leads me to a question I forgot to ask you. What's next? Because you're in 1977. So how far are you going in the next book?
So the next book, if Little Brown wants me to write it, would be set in 1984. And I've started writing it. It takes place on a cruise ship that is heading to Normandy for the 40th anniversary of the invasion, of the D-Day invasion. Okay. And there are a bunch of World War II heroes and generals and figures who are there to be honored, as well as a crowd of individuals who paid to be on this cruise for it. And in the first chapter, one of the generals who was in charge of World War II, of waging that war, disappears. And Lucy is the narrator, and her parents are on the cruise, and that's the basic premise.
Sounds fascinating. Dwight David Eisenhower Jr. Does lead cruises to Normandy. I don't know if you've ever seen the.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, that's interesting.
No. It's one of the. I'm trying to remember whether.
Oh, I just made it up. I didn't know.
No, he actually does.
That's interesting.
It's gone on for years. His dad's unavailable, but there he is. And they do that on a fairly regular basis. And it's I don't remember if it's the Smithsonian or whether just one of the major cruise lines, but for at least 10 years.
Oh, that's cool. I need to find out more about that.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, Ian, I keep interrupting you. Carry on.
Do you prefer being a novelist or a journalist?
Ooh, ooh,
Well, they're two different itches to scratch. I mean, I love my job. I love being a journalist. I love covering the news and being an anchorman and telling, being able to do that job. It's a real pleasure. Fiction is it's tougher in a lot of ways. But it allows me to scratch a creativity itch, a desire to explore a different part of my brain. But it's definitely more difficult, fiction. Nonfiction is tough in its own way, especially if you're telling a story that's difficult, like a school shooting or a war story. My book about Afghanistan, The Outpost, was grueling to write. But at the end of the day, you are sharing other people's stories that are true, and you are, it's just easier because the story is already there. You just have to pick it up and figure out how to tell it, as opposed to fiction, which is just making it up is tough.
What 4 books are you currently reading?
Oh, that's funny. Okay, so you already know I'm reading The Extraordinary Life of an Ordinary Man on Audible. On Kindle right now, I'm just punching it up. On Kindle, I am reading another memoir, Bob Odenkirk's book, Bob Odenkirk's memoir, Comedy, Drama. And at home, I'm reading Don DeLillo's White Noise in a hardback, and then I'm also reading a graphic novel, one of the first Sin City graphic novels by Frank Miller. So those are the 4 right now, and I recognize it's not a particularly diverse group of authors, but this is just kind of like where I landed right this minute. And at any other moment, it might be a completely different grouping.
I don't think anyone should ever, I don't think you're apologizing, but I don't think anyone ever needs to explain what they're reading. I mean, one of the joys of reading is the unexpected, or,
Yeah, except I will say that that after I read Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, I wondered how much I'd been missing by focusing mainly on reading male authors, just instinctively, which I have throughout my life. And so then I started reading, Barbara Kingsolver and just a ton of other authors, and it just really it's not for the sake of diversity, but just for the sake of joy, just opened my mind a bit. And so I am just conscious of it. That's all.
I see what you were saying. Okay, got it. And good for you, by the way.
Well, Gillian Flynn's one of my heroes. I just think she's one of the most brilliant authors out there.
And a great person.
Yeah.
And finally, do your kids enjoy reading books? And if so, do they prefer reading from their phones?
So this new generation gets information in different ways. So they read books, obviously, for school. They're entering 8th grade and 11th grade. And then my daughter's been really into graphic novels, which I think has been really interesting. She wrote a children's book a few years ago about the importance of girls raising their hand, and she's working on another children's book right now. And my son, he is a ravenous consumer of information, but he gets it from like YouTube videos, like credible YouTube videos, not just like weirdos, but like, so he knows a ton about, for example, World War II, that he has just researched online by watching documentaries. So they're not, as of right now, they're not the ravenous readers that I was at that age, but they also have tools to get information that I didn't have. So, I buy them books and they read them, and but they're not quite as bookwormy as I am, at least not right now. But again, they're 13 and 15. I mean, they got a lot going on.
I read somewhere, to wind this up, and I think it's a very true thing, that kids tend to read reasonably heavily, but when they get into their teens, they're distracted by all the things that go on in your teens, and they have to read for school. And in college, the same thing. And then they're starting professional careers, and maybe they're young parents and all of it. And really, they don't come back to reading till they're in their 40s. And by then, readers start picking up again. And I can see that at the store in the audiences that we have, because there's a sort of a gap missing, you know. We see younger readers, and one of the things that happened in the pandemic is that the nature of downtown Scottsdale changed and became more residential. So we moved from a store that sold one children's book a month to, you know, a heavy trading in children's and teenage books and so forth, just because the community changed, which I like. But I can see in our event audiences that there is that kind of gap of the, you know, teen through college and maybe young professional thing, because people just, they're too busy to really.
Also, I think there's something in when you are if you are first introduced to books as something that you have to read for school, then you are being introduced to it in a more joyless way, and you can't really force reading for joy on somebody. They have to find it on their own.
No,
so
but
I don't doubt that my kids.
J.K. Rowling did us all a huge service.
Yes, well, I used to read those with my daughter, and they were great. But my kids are readers. They're just not quite the bookworm I am. They'll get there. I'm not worried. They're too curious.
Of course not. Well,
this has been such a joy, Barbara. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it every time. And anybody watching, thanks so much for joining us. Barbara is just the best host in the world.
Well, that's very kind of you. I have to say, I will always be grateful for David Baldacci's complete technological failure when Jake and I started out here. I was faced with the thought of having to interview Jake Tapper with absolutely no warning. But I've loved it. It's been really great. And I hope that we get to do it for future books and get to meet up in Washington. Thank you all for watching this extra long program. And let me say that the Facebook and the YouTube videos, and there will be a podcast made of this in a day or two. All of those are going to be available forever, so to speak. And I'll get the links to Jake, because basically it becomes a permanent book tour, and you can refer people who weren't fortunate enough today to watch this to watch it at their leisure, which I think is a great thing about.
I will. I'll forward it to everybody I know. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Ian.
Bye, everybody. Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much for joining us. Oh, thank you, Ian. He was probably having to dash off to actually do the news.